The screams that tore from Annalise Fletcher's throat the night her farmhouse burned were swallowed by the roar of flames that painted the Montana sky orange and turned her world to ash. She stood barefoot in the dirt 20 yards from what had been her home, her parents' home, the only place she had ever known in her 22 years of life, and watched the inferno consume everything while the heat blistered her palms and fingers as she clawed uselessly at fallen timber trying to reach her father who had gone back inside for her mother's wedding ring. Neither of them came out. The fire marshal from Helena would later say it was a knocked-over lantern, a simple accident, but that word meant nothing to Annalise as she sat in the ruins 3 days later, her hands wrapped in bandages that were already stained with fluid from her burns, staring at the blackened stones that had once been the fireplace where her mother baked bread every Sunday. The town of Bridger Creek was small, just a scattered collection of buildings along the Yellowstone River where cattle ranchers and miners passed through. And most folks were kind enough in that distant way frontier people were, bringing casseroles and offering prayers, but never quite meeting her eyes because tragedy made people uncomfortable. Annalise had no siblings, no close family except a cousin in Ohio she had never met, and the bank made it clear they wanted the land since her father had still owed money on it. She had 2 weeks to clear out, they said, though there was nothing left to clear except her grief and the clothes on her back that someone from the church had donated. She was sitting on an overturned water bucket in front of the burned ruins on a Tuesday morning in late May of 1882, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching and looked up to see a man she had never seen before riding a dappled gray mare. He was tall even sitting in the saddle, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of pine trees that studied the destruction with an expression she could not quite read. He wore a simple brown shirt and dusty trousers, a working man's clothes, and when he dismounted and removed his hat, she saw he was probably around 27 or 28, weathered by sun and hard living, but with a gentle way of moving that made her not immediately afraid, even though she was alone and vulnerable. "Name's James Brennan," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. "I heard in town what happened here. I am real sorry for your loss." Annalise did not trust her voice, so she just nodded, clutching her bandaged hands in her lap. Most people said their sorries and left, uncomfortable with raw grief, but James did not move toward his horse. Instead, he walked slowly around the perimeter of the burned structure, examining the foundation stones, the partially standing chimney, the way the land sloped gently toward the creek that ran through the back of the property. "You are Annalise Fletcher," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I am," she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse and smoke damage. "Your daddy bought cattle from the ranch I work at, the Triple Bar north of here. He was a fair man, always paid on time." James turned to look at her directly. "What are you planning to do?" The question was so blunt it almost made her laugh, except she had forgotten how. "The bank wants the land. I have no money to pay what is owed. I suppose I will go somewhere, do something." The vagueness of her own future stretched before her like a desert. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked over to where she sat. "Miss Fletcher, I know this might sound strange coming from someone you do not know, but I have been saving my wages for 5 years to buy land and start my own place. This property has good water, good grass, and the bones of a foundation. If you were willing, I could buy it from the bank, pay off what is owed, and you could stay here while I build a new house on this spot." She stared at him like he had spoken a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "Because it is wrong what they are doing to you, taking your family's land when you are grieving," he said simply. "And because I need land and you need a home. I am not asking anything improper. I would sleep in the barn while building. I would give you privacy and respect. I would just be putting a roof over your head while I work." Annalise looked down at her bandaged hands, at the raw pink skin visible at the edges of the wrapping. She had no other options except charity or destitution, and there was something in James Brennan's steady gaze that made her believe he meant exactly what he said. "All right," she whispered. "All right." That is how it started, with a handshake that she could barely complete because of her burned palms, and James riding into town that afternoon to meet with the bank. He returned at dusk with papers showing he had purchased the land outright, paid every cent her father owed plus the fees the bank had tacked on, and when he showed her the deed with her family's name crossed out and his written in, she felt something crack inside her chest that might have been the last piece of her old life breaking away. James was true to his word. He set up a canvas tent for himself near where the old barn still stood partially intact, and he cleared the main house site of debris with a carefulness that surprised her, setting aside anything that could be salvaged: nails, hinges, the iron stove that had survived the flames. Annalise watched from a chair someone had donated, her hands still too damaged to help, and felt useless and hollow. The doctor in town changed her bandages twice a week and said she was lucky the burns were not deeper, that she would have scars but would regain most of the use of her hands, and she nodded, because what else could she do? On the fourth day, James came to where she sat and said, "I am riding to the lumber yard in Livingston tomorrow to order wood. I thought you might want to come along, help decide on the layout of the house since you will be living in it." "It is your house," she said automatically. "It is a house on your family's land that I am building," he corrected. "Seems right you should have a say." The ride to Livingston took most of the morning, and at first they traveled in silence broken only by the sound of hooves and the wind through the grass. But somewhere along the trail James started talking, easy stories about growing up in Wyoming, about working cattle drives and learning carpentry from his father, who had been a builder before drink took him. He did not ask about her loss, and she was grateful for that, grateful to hear about anything except fire and death. At the lumber yard, James spread out papers with sketches he had drawn by lamplight. The house he envisioned was modest but solid: 3 rooms with a separate kitchen, a covered porch, windows that would catch the morning light. He looked at her expectantly, and she realized he truly wanted her opinion. "A window here," she said, pointing to what would be the main room, "facing east. My mother always said morning light made everything more bearable." James nodded and marked it on his sketch. "Good thinking. What about the porch? Wide enough for a chair or two?" "Wide enough for a small table, too," she said, surprising herself. "For taking meals outside when the weather is fine." They spent 2 hours at the lumber yard, and by the time they left with a delivery scheduled for the following week, Annalise realized she had gone 3 whole hours without thinking about the fire. The guilt of that realization hit her like a fist, and she was quiet on the ride back. "You are allowed to keep living," James said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "That is not betraying them." She did not answer, but tears ran down her face and he pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of her grief. The lumber arrived on a Thursday, great stacks of it smelling of pine sap and possibility. James began work immediately, laying the foundation with a precision that spoke of real skill. Annalise's hands had healed enough that she could do small tasks, and despite James's protests that she should rest, she insisted on helping. She mixed mortar, carried tools, held boards steady while he measured and cut. The work made her hands ache, and sometimes the bandages seeped, but it also made her feel less like a ghost drifting through the ruins of her life. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. James woke before dawn and worked until dark, pausing only when Annalise brought him water or the simple meals she managed to prepare on a camp stove he had set up. She learned that he was meticulous and patient, that he never cursed when something went wrong but simply figured out another way, that he had a quiet sense of humor that emerged in small comments that caught her off guard and made her almost smile. "You are good at this," she observed one evening as she watched him fit tongue and groove boards together for the floor. "My daddy was better," James said. "He could make a house sing the way the joints fit. I am just competent. It looks like more than competent to me." He glanced up at her, and something in his expression made her look away, suddenly aware that they were alone together in the middle of nowhere, that tongues in town were probably wagging about the propriety of the arrangement, that she did not care as much as she should. By mid-July the frame was up, skeletal but sturdy, and you could stand inside and imagine walls and a roof. Annalise walked through what would be her bedroom and felt an odd mixture of sadness and anticipation. This was not her parents' house, would never be, but it was rising from the same ground, and that felt important somehow, like continuity in the face of destruction. "You miss the ranch?" she asked James one evening as they sat outside his tent, eating beans and cornbread. "The triple bar. You gave up your work there to do this." "I gave notice proper," he said. "They understood, and no, I do not miss it much. I was tired of working another man's land, building another man's future. This feels right, even if it is hard." "You could have found land anywhere, cheaper probably, without someone else's tragedy attached to it." James set down his plate and looked at her steadily in the fading light. "Maybe I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The words hung between them, and Annalise felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. She was not naive. She knew James was a good man, knew he was handsome in a rough-hewn way, knew that the careful distance he maintained between them was deliberate and respectful. She also knew her own feelings were a confused tangle of gratitude and grief, and something else she was not ready to name. In early August, a storm rolled through with vicious winds that threatened to tear down what they had built. James worked frantically to secure everything while Annalise helped, both of them soaked to the skin and shouting over the thunder. When it passed, they stood together looking at the structure, miraculously still standing, and James laughed with relief and exhaustion. Annalise found herself laughing too, really laughing for the first time since the fire, and when James looked at her with surprise and pleasure in his face, she felt something shift inside her, like a door opening that she had thought sealed forever. The next morning she woke to find James had already started work on the roof. She made coffee and brought it to him, and when he climbed down to drink it, she saw the exhaustion in his face. "You are working yourself to death," she said. "Want to get it finished before winter comes," he replied. "Montana winters are not forgiving, James." She waited until he looked at her. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. "The day I heard about the fire, I was in town buying supplies. Someone mentioned you, said it was a shame about the Fletcher girl who lost everything and would probably end up a charity case or worse. And I do not know why, but something in me just decided right then that was not going to happen, that I was going to do something about it." He looked up at her. "Maybe it does not make sense, maybe I am a fool, but I meant what I said that first day. It was wrong what they were doing, and this felt like something right in a world that often is not." Annalise felt tears sting her eyes but did not look away. "You are not a fool, James Brennan. You are the kindest man I have ever met." His face did something complicated, emotions flickering across it too fast to read, and then he drained his coffee and went back to work on the roof. By September the house was nearly complete, and Annalise could walk through actual rooms with actual walls. James had built everything solid and careful. Doors that hung true, windows that opened smooth, floors that did not creak. He had even carved a simple detail into the porch railing, a pattern of leaves that she recognized from the cottonwoods that grew along the creek. It was beautiful in an understated way, and she ran her scarred fingers over the carving and felt something bloom in her chest that she finally recognized as hope. "I will finish the last of the interior work this week," James said one evening. They were sitting on the new porch watching the sun set over the mountains, a sight she had grown up with but which felt new somehow from this angle. "Then you can move in proper, have a real home again." "What about you?" The question came out before she could stop it. "You own this land." "Where will you go?" James did not answer right away. "I figured I would build a small place for myself back near the barn, something simple. I want to start running cattle on the property, build up a herd. That was always the plan. So you will stay." She tried to keep her voice neutral. "This is my land now," he said simply. "Where else would I go?" They would be neighbors then, she thought, living on the same property but separate, and she told herself that was proper and right and exactly how it should be, even as disappointment settled in her stomach like a stone. The house was finished on a clear morning in late September. James installed the last door, tested the latch, and turned to her with something like pride in his face. "It is done. You want to see?" She walked through slowly, touching the walls he had plastered smooth, the shelves he had built into the kitchen, the small details like hooks for coats and a window seat in her bedroom. It was not large or fancy, but it was solid and well made, and in every board and nail she could see the care James had taken. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. "Board by board," James said quietly. "The way anything worth having gets built." She turned to look at him, and found him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. They were standing in the main room, afternoon light slanting through the windows, and suddenly, the careful distance they had maintained for months felt like a physical thing she could push through if she was brave enough. "James," she started, then stopped because she did not know how to say what she felt. "Annalise." Her name in his voice sounded different, weighted with something that made her heart race. "I need to tell you something, and then I am going to leave you alone so you can think without me hovering." "All right." He took off his hat, turning it in his hands, and she saw that he was nervous, this confident man who had faced down every challenge of building a house with steady calm. "When I first came here, it was because I wanted land, and this seemed like a way to do right by someone who had been wronged. That was true. But somewhere in the last 4 months, something changed for me. Watching you heal, watching you find your strength again, working beside you every day, I fell in love with you, Annalise. Completely and fully in love with you." The words hit her like the storm in August, sudden and overwhelming. She opened her mouth, but James held up a hand. "I know the timing is complicated. I know you are still grieving your family. I know that gratitude can feel like something else, and I do not ever want you to confuse the two. So I am going to give you space, and I am going to start building my own place, and if all you ever want from me is to be neighbors and friends, that will have to be enough. But I needed you to know the truth." He put his hat back on and walked out before she could respond, and she heard the sound of his horse riding away. She stood alone in the house he had built board by board with his own hands, the house that stood on the ground where her old life had burned away, and she looked down at her scarred palms and thought about healing and hope, and the difference between gratitude and love. She knew the difference. Gratitude was what she felt when the church ladies brought food. Love was what bloomed in her chest every time James smiled at her, every time she heard his voice, every time she watched him work with that careful precision that spoke of who he was as a man. Love was what made her laugh again, what made her imagine a future instead of just surviving day to day. Love was James, and she had been too afraid of her own grief to admit it. She found him an hour later at the burned-out barn, already clearing ground for his own place. He looked up when she approached, and she saw hope and fear war in his face. "James Brennan," she said, "I am not confused about gratitude and love. I know the difference because I have felt both, and what I feel for you is not gratitude even though I am grateful. I fell in love with you watching you build something beautiful out of destruction. I fell in love with your kindness and your patience and the way you gave me space to grieve while still making me feel like I was allowed to live. I love you, and I do not want to be neighbors. I want to be your wife if you will have me." The look on his face was worth every moment of fear it took to say the words. He closed the distance between them in 3 long steps and took her scarred hands in his, gentle and sure. "I will have you, Annalise Fletcher. I will have you and love you and build a life with you that is worth everything it took to get here." When he kissed her, it was soft at first, tentative, and then deeper as she pressed closer and wrapped her arms around his neck. He was solid and real and tasted like sawdust and coffee. And she thought about ashes and phoenix rising and all the clichés that were cliché, because they were true. They were married in October by the circuit preacher who passed through Bridger Creek once a month, with half the town attending because frontier people loved a wedding even when they had gossiped about the propriety of the courtship. Annalise wore a simple blue dress that one of the church ladies had sewn for her, and James wore his best shirt and looked nervous and happy in equal measure. When they said their vows, her scarred hands in his calloused ones, she thought about how strange life was, how tragedy and hope could exist in the same space, how the worst thing that ever happened to her had somehow led to the best. They moved into the house James had built, and he abandoned his plans for a separate dwelling. Instead, he focused on building up the ranch, buying a small herd of cattle and hiring a hand from town to help with the work. Annalise threw herself into making the house a home, sewing curtains and planting a garden and cooking meals that got better as she learned. She wrote to her cousin in Ohio to tell her about her marriage, and received a kind letter back wishing her well. The first winter was hard, as all Montana winters were, with snow that piled against the windows and wind that howled around the eaves. But the house James built held strong and kept them warm. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together, and Annalise learned the shape of happiness again, different from the innocent joy of her youth but deeper and more textured. In the spring they expanded the barn and bought more cattle. James proved to have a good eye for livestock, and the herd grew. Annalise helped where she could, learning to ride properly and handle cattle, her scarred hands growing stronger with use. The ranch slowly became profitable, and with the money they made, James hired 2 more hands and began planning further expansion. One evening in early summer, almost exactly a year after James had first ridden onto her burned land, Annalise stood on the porch of their home and watched the sun set over the mountains. She felt James come up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, and she leaned back against him. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about how much can change in a year," she said. "How you can lose everything and find everything in such a short span of time. Any regrets?" She turned in his arms to look at him. "Not a single one. You gave me more than a house, James. You gave me a reason to keep living." "You did that yourself," he said. "I just built the frame. You filled it with life." They kissed as the sun painted the sky orange and red, colors that once would have reminded her of fire and loss but now spoke of beauty and new beginnings. By the following winter, Annalise realized she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, her body changing in ways that were alarming and exciting, and when the doctor in town confirmed it, she rode home in a daze of joy and terror. She told James that evening and watched his face transform through surprise to wonder to fierce protectiveness. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy," he laughed, pulling her close. "Annalise, I am more than happy. I am blessed beyond anything I thought possible." The pregnancy was straightforward, and Annalise bloomed with it, her body finally leaving behind the gauntness of grief. James was impossibly attentive, worrying over her constantly until she had to tell him to stop hovering, or she would lose her mind. The ranch hands teased him mercilessly about his mother-hen tendencies, but she could see they were happy for them, these rough men softened by the prospect of a baby on the property. In late April of 1884, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the next afternoon, Annalise gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas, after her father, and when James held the tiny red-faced infant in his large hands, she saw tears track down his weathered face. "He is perfect," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are perfect. This whole life is perfect." Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, and Annalise took to motherhood with the same determination she had brought to rebuilding her life. James was an involved father, changing diapers and walking the floor with his son in the middle of the night, and generally being more help than she had expected. The ranch continued to grow, and they hired another hand and expanded their herd again. 2 years later, Annalise gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, and then 2 years after that another son they called William. The house James had built was full of noise and life and the chaos of small children, and sometimes when Annalise stood in the kitchen making bread or mending clothes, she would remember her mother doing the same things in the house that burned and feel a pang of loss that never fully went away. But then Thomas would run through asking a million questions, or Catherine would bring her a handful of wildflowers, or William would need to be nursed, and the present would rush back in, and she would remember that grief and joy were not opposites but companions. James proved to be a wonderful father, patient and playful and firm when necessary. He taught Thomas to ride and helped Catherine learn her letters and carried William on his shoulders around the property, pointing out cattle and birds and explaining how the ranch worked. Annalise would watch them together and feel her heart expand with a love so intense it was almost painful. The ranch prospered over the years. What had started as a small operation grew into one of the more successful spreads in the area. James earned a reputation as a fair employer and smart rancher, and Annalise became known for her hospitality and her work with the church in town. They became pillars of the small community, the kind of family people pointed to as examples of hard work and perseverance. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised her with a gift. He led her out to the spot where her parents' house had burned, which they had left untouched all these years, letting grass and wildflowers reclaim it. He had placed a stone marker there, carved with her parents' names and dates. "I thought they should have something," James said quietly. "A place to be remembered." Annalise traced the carved letters with her scarred fingers and felt tears slip down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding that I needed this." They stood together by the marker while their children played nearby, and Annalise thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The fire that had destroyed her old life had cleared the ground for this new one, and while she would never be glad for the loss, she could accept that beauty had grown from ashes, that her scars told a story not just of destruction but of rebuilding and resilience. As the years continued to pass, their children grew. Thomas became a serious young man interested in expanding the ranch's operations. Catherine proved to have a gift for numbers and helped manage the accounts. William, the youngest, had his father's patience and skill with building and began talking about becoming an architect. Annalise and James watched their children develop into capable, kind people and felt the pride that all parents feel when they see their values reflected in the next generation. When Annalise was 42 and James 47, they celebrated the 20th anniversary of the day James first rode onto her burned land and offered to build her a house. The ranch was substantial now, successful enough that they had bought the adjoining property and employed a dozen hands. The house James had built had been added onto twice to accommodate their growing family, but the original structure remained at its heart, solid and true. They sat on that same porch where they had first admitted their love, older now, and weathered by 2 decades of hard work and harsh winters, but their hands still fit together perfectly. Annalise looked down at her scars, faded now but still visible, permanent reminders of the night that changed everything. "Do they still hurt?" James asked, as he had asked hundreds of times over the years. "No," she said, as she always did. "They stopped hurting a long time ago." He raised her hands to his lips and kissed each scarred palm, a gesture so familiar and tender it made her throat tight. "I am glad," he said, "though I admit they remind me of where we started, and I do not entirely mind that." "Where we started," she repeated, thinking about loss and grief and the cowboy who appeared with an offer that seemed too good to be true but turned out to be the realest thing in her life. "And where we ended up." "This is not an ending," James said. "This is just another beginning. We have years ahead of us yet." And they did. Years of watching their children marry and have children of their own, years of seeing the ranch continue to thrive, years of sitting on that porch and watching sunsets together. When Thomas married and brought his wife to live on the ranch, building their own home on the property, Annalise felt the beautiful continuity of family and land and legacy. When Catherine married a banker from Helena and moved to the city, they missed her but were proud of her independence. When William went to study architecture in Denver and returned with both a degree and a husband, they welcomed both with open arms, grateful that their son had found his own version of what they had found together. As grandchildren arrived, the property rang with young voices again, and Annalise delighted in being a grandmother, spoiling her grandchildren in ways she had been too practical to spoil her own children. James built a swing that hung from the old cottonwood by the creek, and multiple generations of children wore the ropes smooth with use. In the winter of 1902, when Annalise was 52 and James 57, they received word that the town of Bridger Creek was planning a celebration for its 50th anniversary, and they wanted to honor the families that had helped build the community. The Brennans were specifically mentioned for their contributions to the local economy and church. At the ceremony, which took place in the new town hall, the mayor spoke about pioneers and perseverance, and Annalise listened with amusement to the romanticized version of their story. "They make it sound so noble," she whispered to James. "They left out the part where I was a mess and you were crazy enough to help a stranger." "I prefer their version," James whispered back. "Makes us sound heroic instead of just stubborn and lucky." But when they stood to accept the recognition, and she looked out at their children and grandchildren in the audience, at the community they had helped build, at the life they had created from the ashes of tragedy, Annalise thought maybe there was something heroic in simply choosing to keep going, in building board by board until you had something worth having. In their 60s, they finally stepped back from active management of the ranch, turning over daily operations to Thomas and his family while they enjoyed a slower pace. James still built things, unable to fully retire from working with his hands, creating furniture for the grandchildren, and adding small improvements to various structures around the property. Annalise spent her time with a large garden, with her grandchildren, and with the church ladies' auxiliary, having somehow become one of the elder stateswomen of the community, despite never quite feeling old enough for the role. They took to sitting on the porch every evening, a ritual that had begun in those early days when the house was new and they were still learning each other. Now, 40 years of marriage had made them so familiar that they could sit in comfortable silence for hours, communication happening in glances and small touches. But they still talked too, sharing stories the other had heard 100 times but which never got old in the retelling. "Do you remember the day we met?" Annalise asked one evening as they watched the sun set over mountains that never stopped being beautiful. "I remember being terrified you would say no," James admitted. "I rode all the way back to the ranch that night second-guessing everything. It seemed insane in retrospect, offering to buy land and build a house for a woman I had never met." "It was insane," Annalise agreed. "But it was also the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me. You saved my life, James." "No," he said firmly, as he always did when she said things like that. "You saved your own life. I just provided the lumber." She laughed and took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after decades of practice. Her scars were thin white lines now, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for them, but she was always aware of them, of what they represented. Loss and survival, destruction and rebuilding, the end of one story and the beginning of another. As the light faded and the stars emerged, bright and infinite in the Montana sky, Annalise thought about the girl she had been, standing in front of a burning house and screaming at the flames that took everything. She thought about the woman she had become, scarred but whole, grieving but joyful, shaped by tragedy but not defined by it. She thought about the man beside her who had appeared at her lowest moment and offered not rescue but partnership, who had built her a home board by board, and then spent 40 years helping her fill it with love. "Thank you," she said quietly. James turned to look at her, his hair gray now but his eyes still that same steady pine green. "For what?" "For riding up to a burned house and seeing possibility instead of just destruction. For giving me space to grieve and time to heal. For falling in love with me when I was at my worst and loving me still at my best. For building me a home and then making it a life worth living." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw the emotion working in his face. "Annalise Brennan, every board I placed, every nail I drove, was worth it 1,000 times over for the life we built together. You were never at your worst. You were at your most vulnerable, and you let me stand beside you while you found your strength again. That was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." They kissed, these two old people who had been young together, who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, who had raised children and built an empire from burned ground and sheer determination. The kiss was soft and familiar, and still capable of making Annalise's heart flutter the way it had that first time in the completed house. As full darkness fell, and they finally went inside to the home that had stood for over 40 years, solid and true and full of memories, Annalise paused in the doorway and looked back at the land spreading out under starlight. Somewhere out there was the marker for her parents, and the original foundation stones of the house that burned, and the barn where James had first cleared ground for his own place before she asked him to stay. Layers of history, visible only if you knew where to look. But here, in the house James built board by board, was the present and future combined. Photographs on the walls showing children and grandchildren. Furniture James had crafted with his own skilled hands. Quilts Annalise had sewn during long winters. the life they had made together from nothing but determination and love. She closed the door against the night and turned to find James waiting for her, his hand extended, and she took it with her scarred palm against his calloused one. And together, they walked deeper into the home they had built, into the life they had created, into the future that stretched ahead of them still, bright and full of possibility despite the ashes they had risen from. Because that was what survival looked like, what resilience meant, what love could do when given the chance. You built something board by board, piece by piece, day by day, until you had created something beautiful and strong that could weather any storm. And if you were very lucky, you found someone willing to build it beside you, someone who saw your scars not as damage but as proof that you had survived, that you were strong enough to start again. Annalise had been that lucky. The fire had taken her home, but James had built her a new one, and in the process, they had built something even more important. They had built a life, and it was good, and it was enough, and it was everything.